Don for that gift of music, and a reminder that we all need sometimes that grace is still amazing.
Amen.
If you'll join with me in a moment of prayer. Most gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing and accepting in your sight, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Well, I think most of us here could probably agree that prayer is an important part of our life as Christians. Many of us probably have a favorite prayer, whether it be from our family or from the Bible, like the Lord's Prayer, or that of someone like St. Francis. And others of us may be more comfortable with extemporaneous prayer. And others of us may not feel confident at all in being able to pray in a group or even alone. And there's other of us who don't have problems praying. But have you ever had a time in your life that your prayer life was difficult for you to live out? Yeah, I think most people would like it. Or have you ever had a time in your life when prayer was answered and you could say, "Praise God, my prayer has been answered"? Or have you witnessed the power and transformation of prayer in someone else's life?
Yep.
Well, this week, I can say I witnessed the power of prayer. I don't want to speak for everyone on the mission trip this week, but I could see the prayers of the people of Sand Hill United Methodist at work in the community of Oak Hill. In the service last week, we prayed together that lives would be transformed, the lives of those working and those receiving the gifts that we were bringing. That transformation for many of us on this trip was probably the first-hand experience of seeing poverty in a new way, a way that we've never experienced before as a group at least. I'm speaking specifically of the realization that poverty and the poor among us don't always fit the labels and descriptors that we like to use. They're not all drug addicts. They're not all lazy. And they're not all people on public assistance. Some of them work hard and have multiple jobs. Some of them even have family members in our military. And there are others that have the education required to get a job but just can't find one. It's a face that we might recognize more often than we realize it. It's a face like that of Roger, whose home we painted this week. Roger lives alone, has a caretaker, either due to a stroke that's paralyzed his left side, or he might have cerebral palsy, which has left him paralyzed as well. Roger's life has been transformed this week by our presence. See, Roger has a house with rotting siding, where he placed a few pieces and then gave his whole house a new, fresh paint of coat. That came up backwards. Fresh coat of paint. But it wasn't just a house. See, it's his family home. His mom had lived there for years. 20 years ago, she passed away, and he moved into her house. It's a home that he can care for on the inside, but he has no way to care for on the outside and do the maintenance because of his physical health conditions. His helper of 11 years, Runt, a little dog, died in December, taking the second tragic death in his life in this home. First his mom, and now his beloved dog, his only companion in life. You see, Roger is alone every day, besides his caretaker, and is dealing with grief. Sure, he may have a new dog named Sparky, and if you're on the trip or around Jenna, you'll hear how she saved Sparky's life. We got into a little fight one of the nights we were there, and she doctored him up. And sure, Roger has siblings and family that live close by, even a church family that will come see him on a regular basis. But see, that doesn't take away grief, especially the grief that he's carried up for his mom and his first dog. He has a story that he's been waiting to tell, just like every person has a story. A story that transformed lives and prayers, at least the ones of those of us who attended the mission trip. So I think for one of his opportunities for transformation occurred by telling us his story. It was also an opportunity for Roger to deal with some of his grief. See, perhaps grief can be compared to his house. It needed to be rebuilt. His whole life could use a new coat of paint just to brighten his world a little. I think the people on the mission trip were touched enough by Roger in this story, as well as our experience with people hovering on the poverty line or living below it, that the poor are now in our prayers every day, not just while we were in mission. And I don't think it's any surprise this morning that in the text that Paul starts to talk about prayer and how he prays for the community in Ephesus. We have to remember that Ephesus at this time was one of the largest parts of Asia, a major city. It was also a Roman province. And according to the 19th and 20th chapters in the book of Acts, we know that Paul spent time ministering there for about 3 years, working in a church and with its people. But upon his exit from the community, he wrote this epistle known as Ephesians, reminding the community of his own prayers for them and how he hoped that they would continue to pray when he left. And I like how John Wesley puts it. He says, it was Paul's way to establish them in the doctrine he had delivered, to arm them against false teachers, and to build them up in love and holiness, both of heart and of conversation. Paul's model of prayer in the 3rd chapter of Ephesians is often debated as to how it should be broken down. But despite the debate, today I want to offer 4 ways I think Paul can inform our own prayer life. I would like to offer those 4 keys as ways in which we can transform our lives, the lives of our members in the church, our friends, our neighbors, this community, and the world. First, they were praying so that the Spirit of God would give them strength. And then that Christ would dwell in their hearts, and that they would have the power to comprehend the wideness and vastness of God, and that we would know the love of Christ above all. So as we look at each of these 4 aspects of prayer this morning, I think it's important to remember that Paul, being brought up in the Jewish traditions, was accustomed to standing for prayer. And I don't know if you caught it in the text, but Paul kneels. Something for us to take note of. He probably had spent most of his life standing just like this, with his arms wide open, ready to receive the words of God, follow the movement of the Holy Spirit, the oldest stance of prayer that we know. But for some reason, Paul felt he needed to kneel. So it's on his knees that he begins to pray that the Spirit of God would give strength. And I don't know about you, but I think strength in this context is a bit deceiving. When we hear strength, we might think of the physical type. The type that I think several of the adults on the mission trip wish we had when it came to getting in and out of the rafting boats. You know, where you have to flex your muscles and hold on tight. Or maybe it's the times when we're in the kitchen trying really hard to open jars. Or perhaps it's mental strength, when you're preparing for a test, or a difficult assignment at work, or even a task at home that you don't like to do. Or perhaps you've even thought it might imply to financial strength, so we don't have to worry about living paycheck to paycheck. But Paul's prayer for strength from God has nothing to do with these types of strength. He is talking about strength at the core of our being, that God will give us strength at the deepest point within us, having spiritual power and strength flow into every part of our lives. It's like having a good foundation. We have to be strong at the core, where it counts most in life. For everything else around us is sustained by it. So the next time you're at the gym or struggling in the kitchen or are out and hear someone mention they need to work on core exercises, I hope it reminds you to work on your own core of your spiritual life. That you're willing to dig deep and do the work so that God will give you the strength where it counts most. And the second example uplifted by Paul is that we should pray that Christ dwells in our hearts. This type of dwelling reminds me of the hymn writer who talks about Jesus walking in the garden, actually uses the words tarrying in the garden, so that a joy could be shared with Mary that no one else would ever know. Jesus dwells in our hearts, brings us a joy that should be shared, so that people can hear of Christ in a way that they've never known before. It's not the kind of love or joy that disappears with the changing of seasons or tides. It's one that's sustainable, one that will be present when it doesn't always feel like it should be or we feel like we can see it, one that will grow deeper with time. It's a love that should have access to every part of our lives, to all the compartments in which we think we can hide and separate our love. I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we allow ourselves to share love differently. For example, we may love our family members a little differently than we love coworkers or neighbors or even a friend. It's the kind of love that allows Jesus into parts of our hearts and lives that we keep hidden from everyone else, even our family. It's a love that knows no barriers, has no walls, no depths or no distance too far to separate us from that love of God and of Jesus. And the third way Paul reminds us that we should be praying is to have power to comprehend the wideness and vastness of God. This morning I asked the kids to try to capture the wideness and vastness of God in a picture. It was a little difficult to do for some, others seemed to have managed it. But I think if we were to try to draw it, it would probably be a pretty difficult picture to get. But perhaps the kids should help us see that another way of looking at it is we should be overwhelmed by trying to fit everything that we know about God's love in a picture. Overwhelmed by a love that knows no depths, no heights, no distance, that knows no borders. However, it is here that Paul reminds us that knowing is something that cannot be fully attained, at least not in the human state. John Wesley writes that this only we know, that the love of Christ surpasses all knowledge, that you may be filled, which is the sum of it all, with all the fullness of God, with all his light, his love, his wisdom, his holiness, his power and glory, a perfection far beyond the bare freedom from sin. So as you explore the vastness and wideness of God's love in this world and your own life, don't forget to ask to be filled so that you can experience a perfection far beyond a bare freedom from sin. And lastly, Paul tells us to pray so that we may know the love of Christ. See, this is where I think we need to be most careful with Paul's advice, because this is a prayer that sometimes takes us places we may not really want to go. It takes us to places where we are going to experience love by people we don't always want to be seen with. Just like Jesus was seen with a woman at a well, where he intervened at the stoning of a woman, when he fed 5,000 plus people, when he welcomed children that weren't supposed to be near him, when he held the hands of the dying and the sick, when he healed them, and when he helped widows. See, these are not just stories in Jesus' time that we look to, but it's a reality that many people still live today. It could be that our prayers will most literally be answered and lead us to places where the least of these are waiting for us, to borders where displaced people are crossing because of war and famine. Or it may even take us to war-torn regions where people do not know what it is to have peace, where children have lived their entire lives having to hide and protect their siblings, duck when they hear gunshots. They've had to witness violence that no one in this world should ever have to see. It may even take us to underneath bridges, where hungry and homeless people gather in search of food and clothing. It may take us to jails filled with innocent and guilty. People that are desperate for someone to listen to their story. Or it may mean being a neighbor to someone that would really rather maintain the status of their neighbor. My friends, I hope that you're careful what you pray for, because it may take you places to experience the love of Christ in ways you've never imagined and you've never known before, and will never be the same after. I guarantee you that you'll never be the same, and perhaps rightly so, just like those of us who met Roger. Perhaps at the heart of Paul's four-part prayer is that we are transformed in such a way that the good news of Jesus and his love will be a story we cannot hide from, a story we cannot hide from the world, but will be our anthem, the light in which we carry, the joy that we tarry, a love and a story that no one will have ever known before. So I pray this morning that it may be so for you and for me. Amen.